The briefing said the Vorath didn't use blades. That was the first thing Marcus Hale read when the assignment landed on his tablet at 400, still smelling of ship-recycled air and the bad coffee he'd been rationing since Kepler Station. The intelligence summary was 6 pages long, and he read all of it twice, the way his first trainer had taught him, once fast for the shape, once slow for the lies. The shape was simple: escort the Vorath dual sovereignty on a diplomatic transit through contested space, 4 days, low profile, no weapons fire expected. The lies were in what it didn't say, what no intelligence summary ever said, the part that happened in the gap between expected and actual. He set down the tablet, he picked up his coffee. He thought about the word sovereignty and how it was plural. 2 queens. He'd never pulled a 2-queen assignment. The Vorath were not human. That needed saying plainly because after 3 years working alien dignitary protection, Marcus had noticed a tendency in his colleagues, good people, trained people, to smooth the strangeness down into manageable shapes. To say things like, "They're actually very relatable once you get past the carapace," or "Their hierarchy is basically feudal so it maps pretty cleanly." He'd learned to distrust that smoothing. The Vorath were not human. They were bilaterally symmetric in the wrong directions. Their 2 primary limbs designed for grip rather than reach. Their 4 secondary limbs folded at rest in a configuration that human eyes wanted to read as prayer, but was actually the resting state of their circulatory compression system. Their faces, if you could call the anterior sensory cluster a face, ran entirely to chemoreception and infrared. No eyes. They navigated the visible spectrum through a distributed pressure sensing network embedded in their outer integument, which meant they could feel light, literally feel it, and they processed it in a part of their cognition that humans used for spatial reasoning. They were not relatable. They were extraordinary in the original sense of the word, outside the ordinary, beyond the frame. He'd been assigned to extraordinary before. He could work with it. The shuttle bay was cold and smelled of ionized metal and something floral that turned out to be coming from the Vorath Advanced Delegation's Atmospheric Amendment Unit, a small humming box they'd set up in the corner of the bay that pushed out a combination of particulates calibrated to keep their sensory cluster comfortable during interspecies contact. It smelled, to Marcus, like someone had left a gardenia inside a particle accelerator. He noted it. He didn't comment on it. The advanced delegation was 4 individuals in function armor, matte black, the Vorath equivalent of a security detail. They moved well. He watched them for 90 seconds while pretending to review his transit manifest, and he cataloged what he saw. Disciplined spacing, good corner coverage, cross-communication happening through some combination of pheromone and pressure pulse he couldn't detect. They were treating the bay the way he would treat a bay. He felt a small, involuntary thing that might have been professional respect, and then he felt something cooler and more useful, which was the recognition that these were not ceremonial guards. Whatever the briefing said about low-profile diplomatic transit, the Vorath were not operating under the assumption that nothing would happen. He adjusted his threat assessment accordingly. "Commander, yes," the Vorath officer tasked with coordinating between the delegations, introduced herself through the translation rig with careful formality. The rig rendered her speech as something flat and grammatically rigid, stripped of whatever tonal qualities the Vorath language carried. Marcus had worked with enough translation technology to know that what he was hearing was a skeleton, the structure of the communication, not its texture. He responded in kind. They established protocols for the transit. Zone assignments, signal codes, escalation procedures. Standard. Clean. The whole time he watched the advanced team move, and he learned the way they learned, which was by absorbing everything and discarding nothing. The dual sovereignty boarded at 7:30. He had seen images. The images hadn't prepared him. They moved in absolute synchrony, not the trained synchrony of performance, but something deeper and stranger. The synchrony of 2 organisms that had learned the other's rhythm so completely that the rhythm had become shared. The Vorath word for their bond, the translation rig told him, was something that rendered approximately as the same breath in two bodies, and watching them move across the boarding ramp, he understood why. Queen Tessavrath was taller by perhaps 4 centimeters, her carapace carrying more of the dark amber banding that Marcus had come to understand as a marker of rank. Queen Veth was broader across the primary limb span, her movement carrying a quality that his threat training registered as combat-ready even at rest. They were different in the small ways that mattered, and identical in the ways that counted most. They stopped when they reached him, both of them, together in a single movement that wasn't choreographed. He didn't know if they could see him in any meaningful sense. He looked at them anyway, the way he looked at everyone he was assigned to protect, like they were the most important thing in any room he was ever in. He said to both of them, "I'm Marcus Hale. My job is to make sure you get where you're going." Commander Yes translated. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes, his actual eyes, which they couldn't use, pointed at them, because the gesture had to mean something even if the mechanism was wrong. One of them responded. The translation rig put a delay on it and then produced, "You are one." "Yes," he said. The human delegation provides one protection agent for the dual sovereignty. It wasn't a question. It was a statement with an edge on it. He recognized the edge. "The human delegation provides me," he said. "I'm sufficient." Another translation delay. Then something he could have sworn was amusement, although he had no idea what amusement looked like on a Voreth face, and the sound the rig produced was a flat declarative. "We will see," it said. He thought, yes, you will. The transit ship was the Ardent Meridian, a mid-class diplomatic carrier registered out of the Conclave neutral zones. It was not glamorous. The corridors were functional gray, the viewports scratched from micrometeorite dust, the recyclers loud enough to hear from 3 compartments away. Marcus had worked on worse. He had worked on ships where the recyclers didn't work at all, which had a way of focusing everyone's attention very quickly on the shared project of not dying from atmospheric poisoning. He found the Ardent Meridian almost cozy by comparison. He established his watch rotation on the first day. 6 hours on, 2 hours rest, 6 hours on, 2 hours rest, repeat until the transit ended or something happened to make the rotation irrelevant. He'd done this so many times that his body had adapted to it the way some people adapt to shift work. The off hours weren't quite sleep, more a kind of sustained low vigilance that his brain had learned to use as recovery. He ate his meals standing near doors. He drank his water in small amounts, frequently. He kept his sidearm at a draw angle that the Voreth security team could see clearly, which was a kind of language. "I am armed. I am not concealing that I am armed. I am not a threat to you." The Voreth security team, he noticed, did not sleep. They sustained something the translator described as reduced vigilance intervals, but they were never fully offline. He added this to his model of them and felt his respect deepen slightly, the way it did when you found out someone you were working alongside had a skill you hadn't seen yet. He learned their names. Or rather, he learned the sounds the translation rig produced in place of their names. Keth, Davin, Sarath, and the one who never gave a name at all and responded only to a particular pressure pulse signal that Marcus couldn't produce. He called that 1-4 in his head, with no disrespect intended. On the second day, Queen Tessavrath asked to speak with him. Commander Yes facilitated. The Queen was in her private quarters, a section of the ship's middecks that had been atmospheric-amended to Voreth comfort levels, which meant the air was slightly thick and carried a consistent low-frequency hum that Marcus felt in his molars. He stood at parade rest just inside the entrance and waited while Yes arranged the translation rig. The Queen said something, the rig processed. The output was, "You stood differently when we boarded. Before we saw you, you were watching my people." He considered his response. "Yes," he said, "I was assessing them." "Why tell me that?" "Because you already know it, And because we're going to work together better if we don't pretend. The translation delay. Then, my sister says you look at us the way our own guards look at us. He thought about that. That's my job, he said. I'm not sure what their job is. Their job is the same as yours, but they look at us because they are required to. You look at us. A pause, longer than a translation delay warranted, which meant the Queen was choosing her words carefully, as though we are worth looking at. He didn't know what to say to that. He said the thing that was true. You are, he said, both of you. Queen Veth stepped into the doorway on the fourth word, and he registered her presence without turning his head, because he'd logged her position 6 seconds before she moved. She stood there, and he understood without the translation rig that she had heard what he'd said. He kept his eyes forward, both queens worth looking at. The trouble came on the third day, which is when trouble usually comes, late enough that everyone has begun to relax into routine, early enough that there's still time for everything to go wrong. The alert was soft at first. A flicker in the transit corridor's proximity sensors that could have been debris, could have been a sensor artifact, could have been the leading edge of something Marcus didn't want it to be. He was at his post outside the Queen's quarters when it registered on his wrist unit. He pulled the display. He looked at the shape of the flicker. He felt something cold and very certain settle in his chest, the way it always did when his instincts got ahead of his evidence. He keyed Commander Yes. Your people seeing the same thing I am. Yes came back immediately. Confirmed. Keth is attempting to characterize. We assess low probability of. Get the queens to the secondary refuge compartment, Marcus said. Now, low probability is not zero probability. A pause. Protocol was to reach consensus between the security teams before moving the principals. Protocol was designed for situations where there was time to reach consensus. Hail. Yes, now. He was already moving when she said it. He pushed through the quarters door without announcement and found both queens exactly where he expected them. Tessavrath in the meditative posture he'd catalogued on day 1, Veth standing near the viewport, her secondary limbs doing the folded prayer thing that wasn't prayer. They both turned toward him with that eerie synchrony, and he didn't stop moving. Secondary refuge, he said, please right now. He didn't know if they could read urgency in a human voice. He put everything he had into the word now. He moved toward the interior corridor that led aft, toward the compartment the ship's security schematics designated as the hardened refuge for primary passengers. They moved. He didn't know why. They hadn't waited for the translation rig, hadn't waited for yes, hadn't conferred with each other through whatever private channel they used. They just moved, both of them together, following him down the corridor with the long, fluid stride of their species. And Marcus Hale, who had been in enough situations to know that sometimes the only explanation for why something worked was that it worked, let himself feel a sliver of relief. The sensors lit up like a festival. He had the Queen 6 steps from the refuge compartment door when the boarding breach hit, not the main corridor, not where the sensors had been flickering, but a service junction 3 meters above them in the maintenance shaft, which meant whoever planned this had fed them the decoy, reading deliberately to move the queens away from the primary quarters and into the corridor. It was a good plan. He hated it on a pure professional level. The hatch blew, and 4 figures dropped into the corridor. He didn't fully process them as individuals. He processed them as shapes with intent vectors, 2 moving toward the queens, 2 covering the corridor ends, species, Dreth, which registered in his combat memory as strong, fast, and carrying composite fiber blades rather than energy weapons, because in a ship corridor, an energy weapon that misses goes through hull plating. The Dreth had done their homework. He processed all of this in approximately 1/3 of a second, and then he stopped thinking and started working. The first blade came at Queen Tessavrath. He stepped into it. The composite edge opened a line across his left forearm from wrist to elbow, and he registered it the way he registered most pain in these moments, not as pain but as information, as the body saying this is where I was and this is what changed. He grabbed the arm that held it and used the Dreth's own momentum to turn it into the corridor wall. He felt the crack of impact through his palms. The Dreth went down. The second figure was faster. It had already redirected toward Queen Veth. He was not fast enough. He knew it in the same moment he knew he was going to try anyway, because there was a particular kind of certainty that arrived with long years of this work, a certainty that had nothing to do with calculation. You didn't calculate, you moved. You let the thing you'd practiced 10,000 times happen in the body, and you didn't get in its way. He got in front of Queen Veth. The second blade took him in the shoulder. The third, from the figure he'd been tracking at the corridor end, caught him across the ribs when he turned. He hit the figure coming from the left with everything he had, and they both went down, and he was on his feet again before he'd finished processing what had happened to his shoulder, and the fourth one, the last of them, had a blade already moving. Queen Tessivrath was behind him. He didn't know how. He'd been tracking her at his right and somehow she'd gotten behind him, and the fourth blade was angled for her, and he turned. The fourth blade hit him in the side. He caught the wrist on the backswing. He put the figure down with a technique his trainer had called inelegant but effective, and that Marcus had always preferred for exactly those qualities. He stood in the corridor with his hands at the ready, and there was no one left to put down. His wrist unit was screaming alerts. He could hear running in the maintenance shaft above him. Yes's voice was in his earpiece saying words he wasn't parsing yet. He counted. 4 attackers, 5 blade strikes, left forearm, shoulder, ribs twice, side. He did this the way he'd been taught to do it, cataloging the damage before the adrenaline wore off and the damage became less abstract, more insistent. He'd been told by a doctor once that this habit was pathological. He told the doctor that pathological beat dead, and the conversation had ended. He turned to the queens. They were both there, both of them. Tessivrath, with her primary limbs extended in what he had over 3 days come to recognize as high alertness. Veth completely still, and he had learned that Veth's stillness was not absence but its opposite, a quality of focused presence so complete that it registered as emptiness. They were both unhurt. He checked twice, 3 times. He said, "We need to get to the refuge compartment." His voice came out strange. He noticed this and filed it away. Yes came through the door at the far end of the corridor with Keth and Davin at angles, blades not quite drawn. She stopped when she saw the corridor. She stopped for a full 2 seconds, which for Yes was an eternity. "Hale," she said, through the rig flat and careful, "are you functional?" "Refuge compartment," he said. "Secure the queens first." "Hale." "Yes." He put everything he had into making it a complete sentence. "I'll still be here when you get back." She held his gaze, or whatever it was that passed for holding someone's gaze when you navigated the visible spectrum through your skin, for another second. Then she moved. Keth and Davin flanked the queens. The queens moved with them and Marcus watched them go and he thought, "There. That's done. That part is done." Then he sat down on the corridor floor, because the alternative was something less dignified. He didn't go unconscious. He came close. There was a quality to his vision that suggested the possibility, a brightening around the edges that his brain interpreted as a warning. But he'd been in enough situations like this to know the difference between a wound that was going to let him stay awake and one that wasn't, and this was the former. This was going to let him stay awake and hurt, which was a worse version of things but significantly better than the alternative. He focused on the texture of the floor beneath his palms. Cold, slightly ridged from the non-slip surface treatment. He counted the ridges he could feel. He hummed something under his breath without choosing to, something his mother had sung when he was very young, a few bars of it before he caught himself and stopped. He thought 5 blades. He thought both of them unhurt. He thought those 2 thoughts back and forth while the corridors were sealed, and the ship's medical system was pinged, and Yes came back in 8 minutes with a kit and hands that moved with extraordinary gentleness over his wounds. And he sat on that floor and thought about the math of it, 5 blades for 2 queens. And he found it was very simple math. It did not feel like duty. It felt like the only possible answer to the question the situation had asked. He wasn't sure when he lost the thread. Somewhere between Yes closing the shoulder wound and someone putting something warm across his back, which he registered as happening and could not identify the source of. He thought he said something. He thought someone answered. He wasn't sure. Then he was somewhere warm and horizontal and very still, and he was not in the corridor anymore. He came back to himself slowly, the way you come back from deep water, not all at once, but layer by layer, the body reassembling its relationship to the world in stages. Hearing first. The recyclers, different pitch than the ardent meridian, slower, more even, which meant a larger system, which meant he wasn't on the transit ship anymore. Temperature. Warm, consistently warm, which meant atmospheric control far better than anything a mid-class diplomatic carrier ran. Smell, the Gardenian particle accelerator smell, very close, very strong. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was high and pale amber, which was not a color he associated with any human facility. The light came from somewhere indirect, distributed, no point sources, just an even warm luminescence that reminded him, absurdly, of late afternoon light through good curtains. He was on a surface that was horizontal and adequately soft, and he was under something that was warm without weight, which was a property he couldn't immediately explain through any material he knew. His wounds had been tended. He could feel the particular tight, clean sensation of closed tissue, the faint numbness that accompanied tissue regrowth therapy. Whoever had worked on him knew what they were doing. He turned his head. Both queens were there, sitting. At his bedside, or rather, on either side of what he was lying on, at a distance that the translation rig, if he'd had one, might have described as close but respectful. Tessavrath on his left, her primary limbs folded in a configuration he hadn't seen before, which his brain catalogued as new, possibly significant. Veth on his right, perfectly still in her particular way. He lay there and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, how long. He didn't know if they understood him without the rig. He figured the question was simple enough, and he had nothing to lose. Tessavrath moved. Not toward him, a lateral shift, an adjustment of posture. He thought that might be an acknowledgement. Veth did something that he registered as reaching, although the mechanics were not quite human reaching. A slow extension of one primary limb toward the low surface beside him, where there was a device he didn't recognize. She touched it. A small click. And then a voice came out of it, flat and translated, that said, 30 hours. He processed that. We made it to the destination. Another touch of the device. To safe harbor, yes. He lay there. The ceiling was very amber. The light was very even. He thought about 30 hours of this, both of them here, sitting, whatever it meant for a Vorath to sit at the side of an injured human, and he felt something he couldn't name clearly, something in the vicinity of moved without quite being that word. He said, you didn't have to stay. Veth touched the device. The flat voice said, you took 5 blades. That's the job, he said. A longer silence. Tessavrath made a sound not into the device, just into the air of the room, a low, complex pressure pulse that he felt in his chest and couldn't parse. Then she touched the device and the translation came out as, our guards say the same thing. That's because it's true, Marcus said. Our guards, Veth said, through the device. And this was Veth, he could tell by now. There was something different in the quality of her stillness before she spoke. Do not hum while they work. He opened his mouth. He closed it. 2 bars, she said, in the corridor before you stopped yourself. He stared at the amber ceiling. He felt something that in different circumstances he might have described as embarrassed. I didn't know you could hear that, he said. We feel sound differently than you, said Tessavrath. In the corridor, when everything was loud and wrong, that sound was another pause that was about word choice, not translation, very specific, very small. We noticed it. He thought about what he'd been humming. He thought about his mother, which was not something he did often, because it led to other thoughts, and he'd learned that certain chains of thought were better kept short during active operations. He thought about the fact that two alien queens had noticed 2 bars of a melody his mother used to sing in the corridor of a ship, while he was sitting on the floor bleeding, and he did not know what to do with that. He said, "It's something my mother used to sing. I don't do it on purpose." The translation device sat quiet for a moment. Then Tessavrath said, "We know things we don't do on purpose." He looked at her. She had no eyes for him to look at, and he looked at her anyway. She had her primary limbs in that new configuration, and he thought, she had them like that when I woke up. She's been like that for 30 hours. Is that, he started. He wasn't sure how to finish. That configuration, your arms. He gestured inadequately at his own arms. Is that something specific? Tessavrath was still for a long moment. Then, it is what we do when we remain with someone, to mark that we remain. He absorbed that. Is it common to remain with someone who's injured? With those we are responsible for, she said. Yes. I'm not someone you're responsible for, he said. That's backwards. I'm responsible for you. Another silence. Then Veth, still and present and precise, said, "We do not think it works only one direction." He lay on that surface under that weightless warmth and looked at the amber ceiling and thought, 30 hours. Both of them. The same configuration for 30 hours. He thought about what it meant to stay with someone in a system of meaning that he didn't fully understand, in postures he'd never seen before, because the thing he'd done was something that required a response they hadn't needed to give but had given anyway. He said, "I need to ask you something." He waited for Veth to bring up the device. "Yes," she said. "When I turned in the corridor, the 4th one was going for you." He looked at Tessavrath. "You'd moved. You were behind me. I'd had you tracked at my right." Tessavrath was still. Then, yes. "Why?" he said. A very long pause. Tessavrath and Veth did something then that he couldn't characterize. A brief exchange that ran entirely below any register his senses could access, pressure and chemistry, and the invisible grammar of beings who had grown up learning each other so completely that the learning had become the self. Then Tessavrath put her primary limbs back into the configuration she'd been holding, and Veth was perfectly still, and the device said, in the flat translated voice, "Because we wanted to see what you would do." He blinked. He started. "That's a significant risk to test someone." "Yes," said Veth. "You could have been killed." "Yes," said Tessavrath. "I could have failed." "Yes," said Veth, "but we did not think you would." He thought about what that meant. He thought about the first day, in the shuttle bay, watching him watch their security team. The conversation on the second day, "You look at us as though we are worth looking at." 3 days of him carrying the job the way he always carried it, not as obligation but as something he actually believed in, and apparently they had been watching him believe in it, the way he watched everything, and they had built a picture of what he would do, and then they had tested it in the most direct and dangerous way possible. He said, "That's a very alien thing to do." The device produced something that his brain, lacking any other reference, categorized as laughter, not the sound of it, but the function of it, the acknowledgement of a shared understanding of the absurd. "Yes," said Tessavrath. He was quiet for a while. The recyclers hummed their slow, even hum. The light stayed amber. He felt the tightness of his closed wounds and the particular ache of tissue working on its own repair, and he thought about 5 blades and what they had bought, and he thought about what the queens were sitting in. He thought about what it meant to earn someone's trust by letting them see you choose. "Are you going to leave?" he asked, "now that I'm awake?" A pause. The device, "Do you want us to leave?" He thought about it honestly. The way he thought about everything without the smoothing, without the comfortable shape. He thought about the amber ceiling and the warm light and two queens who had sat in configuration for 30 hours and hummed 2 bars in a corridor and a man who had gone into 5 blades without calculation, just with the knowledge of what the answer had to be. No, he said, I don't. Tessavrath adjusted her primary limbs slightly, still in the configuration, still staying. Veth said through the device, with her particular quality of stillness that was not empty but completely full, then we will remain. He closed his eyes. The recyclers hummed. The light came from everywhere and nowhere and was very warm. He was not asleep, but he was in the place that his body had learned to use as rest, the low vigilance interval, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely calculate, he did not feel the need to be at a door angle. He hummed 2 bars, he let himself. Neither of the queens moved, but he felt, with the certainty that came from 3 days of learning them and 30 hours of being watched over by them, that they noticed, and that noticing meant something. Not something he had the language for, not something the translation rig could flatten into a declarative sentence. Something that lived in the gap between expected and actual, in the space where the briefing ended and the real work began. He thought 2 queens. He thought, I've never pulled a 2-queen assignment. He thought, I think I understand now why there are 2. The Vorath dual sovereignty, the same breath in 2 bodies, had held that configuration for 30 hours at the side of a human being who had gone into 5 blades without calculating the math, and the configuration meant we remain, and they remained, and Marcus Hale, who had been trained to look at everyone he protected as the most important thing in any room, lay in the amber warmth of a room he didn't know, and felt the truth of it work its way through him, the way truth does when it's been earned. Slowly and with weight, and with no surprise at all. He said very quietly to the ceiling, You're both worth it. He didn't look to see if they heard. He didn't need to. He already knew. The debrief happened on the 4th day, in a room that was more human in its proportions, rectangular, well lit in the flat, practical way of institutional spaces, a table with chairs and a pitcher of water and a data terminal that kept the mission report on one side and the incident report on the other. Commander Yes was there, and a Vorath diplomatic officer whose function rank Marcus placed at roughly equivalent to a senior attaché, and a human conclave liaison named Ajani who had the specific quality of cheerful competence that Marcus associated with people who had survived very long careers in very difficult environments. Ajani had a scar across his left hand that Marcus recognized as a blade scar, old and clean, and he felt the small, involuntary recognition of it. The incident report was thorough. The Dreth operatives had been identified, 3 known contract assets working through a third-party intermediary, whose interests in disrupting the Vorath diplomatic transit were still being untangled. The service junction breach had been pre-planned with inside information on the ship's sensor configuration, which meant the investigation had threads to pull in the Ardent Meridian's crew manifest. Marcus read all of this and noted it and said nothing, because it was not his work to do. His work was done. What was not in the incident report, what no report ever captured, was the amber room and the configuration and 2 bars of a melody and 30 hours and the phrase we will remain. He thought about that. He thought about all the things reports could not hold. Ajani said, reading from the terminal, in the pleasant voice of someone who dealt with extraordinary events by describing them in the most ordinary language possible, 5 blade contacts, 3 operatives neutralized, 1 detained, 1 exfiltrated before perimeter closed. He looked up from the terminal. You received all 5 blade contacts. Yes, Marcus said. The principals were unhurt. Yes. The report from the Vorath medical staff indicates that you were in moderate to severe trauma when you reached the harbor facility. He thought about what moderate to severe trauma felt like from the inside, which was less dramatic and more mechanical than the phrase suggested. I was functional when it mattered, he said. That's the standard. Ajani looked at him for a moment. Is it, he said, not a question. It's my standard, Marcus said. Yes said something to the diplomatic officer in Vorath, a short exchange outside the translation rig, which meant they weren't translating it for him, which meant it was about him. He noted this without concern. He'd been discussed before. The diplomatic officer then said something to the rig, which produced, "The dual sovereignty has requested that your service assignment be extended." Marcus kept his face neutral. Extended to what scope? To the full diplomatic mission, duration approximately 40 days. The sovereignty has expressed specific confidence in your, a pause in the translation, the kind of pause that meant the rig was working on a word that didn't map cleanly, your manner of looking. Ajani's mouth moved in what Marcus identified as the suppressed version of a smile. He thought about 40 days. He thought about the amber room and the queens in configuration and the question they had asked him, "Do you want us to leave?" and his answer. He thought about being responsible for someone and that responsibility being, apparently, not a one-direction thing. He said, "I accept." The formal language of the extension required signatures and seal registrations and the translation rig working overtime, and Marcus stood through all of it and said what needed to be said and did not think about the amber ceiling. He would think about the amber ceiling later. He was good at that compartmentalization. His trainers had called it. The ability to file a thing away and live with it intact rather than having to understand it immediately. He had filed many things. Some of them he had opened years later and found they had changed while they waited. He thought this one might be like that, the kind of thing that changed while it waited. On the way out of the debrief room, Ajani fell into step beside him. They walked for a moment in companionable silence, the way people who have worked the same difficult territory walk together. No need to establish it, just the recognition of shared ground. Ajani said, "I've been doing this 23 years. "I know," Marcus said. He'd read Ajani's file. "I have never had a principal request a specific agent for an extended mission," Ajani said, "let alone both principals, simultaneously." Marcus said nothing. "Whatever you did," Ajani said, "between the briefing and the harbor facility." "The job," Marcus said. Ajani stopped walking. Marcus stopped too. Ajani looked at him with the old blade scar across his left hand and the 23 years behind his eyes and said, "The job doesn't usually do that." Marcus thought about 5 blades and the math of it and the thing that lived in the gap between expected and actual. He thought about what the answer to the situation had been and how he'd known it without calculation. He said, "I know." He walked back to his temporary quarters and sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at his hands. His left forearm was still healing. The tissue growth therapy had him at about 70%, which was enough to work with. His shoulder moved correctly. His ribs ached in the specific way of new tissue under load, which he had learned to treat as information rather than complaint. 5 blades. He counted them. He always counted them. Forearm, shoulder, ribs, side. He named them the way some people named scars with stories, not with sentiment but with the practical acknowledgement that they were a record of something real. They were the record of what had been asked and what he had answered. He thought about the Queen's question, "Why did you do it?" They hadn't asked that, not in those words. They had asked what he would do, and then they had watched him do it, and then they had sat in configuration for 30 hours and said, "We will remain." The question hadn't needed asking because they had already seen the answer. You saw the answer and then you stayed with it, in the configuration that meant staying, because some answers required witness. He thought, I think that's what they were doing. I think 30 hours in the configuration that means we remain was their version of the answer to the question they never needed to ask. He lay back on the bunk and looked at the institutional ceiling, which was white and flat and entirely without amber. He thought about 40 days. He thought about 2 queens and a diplomatic mission, and all the things that were not in reports, and all the things that changed while they waited. He thought about his mother's song and 2 bars in a corridor, and the knowledge that he'd been heard. He closed his eyes. The recyclers hummed a different pitch here. He learned the pitch. He would be here for 40 days, and he would learn everything about this place the way he learned everything. As though it was worth learning, as though the learning itself was a form of looking, as though to understand a thing fully was a way of saying you were worth looking at. Both of them worth it. He did not hum. He let himself almost hum, and then he slept in the real way, the way his body remembered from before the years of this work had taught it the useful half-vigilance. He slept like a person who had put something down and did not need to pick it back up until morning. Outside in the corridor of the harbor facility, Commander Yes stood at her post. And somewhere in the section of the facility, atmosphere recommended to Vorath comfort levels. 2 queens sat in the configuration that meant remaining, and breathed the same breath in 2 bodies, and did not speak to each other about the human who was sleeping. They did not need to. They had already said what needed saying, in 30 hours and in a configuration and in the phrase "we will remain," and those were things that lived in the gap between expected and actual, in the space where the briefing ended and something else began, something that no translation rig could flatten and no report could hold. But that was real anyway, as real as 5 blades and 2 bars of a song, and a man who looked at them as though they were worth looking at. And they were. And he knew it. And so did they. The 40 days were not uneventful. Nothing in Marcus Hale's professional life had ever been simply uneventful. But they were eventful in the way that good work is eventful, with problems that had solutions, and difficulties that required thought, and days that accumulated into a record of something being accomplished carefully, and without unnecessary cost. He learned the facility. He learned its corridors in the way he learned all corridors, with his whole attention, as though the architecture itself was something worth knowing. He learned the staff. He learned the guard rotation of the Vorath security complement, which had expanded for the full mission to 8 individuals, including his old acquaintance 4, who still gave no name and whose pressure pulse signal Marcus had still not learned to produce, but had learned to recognize as something approximating professional regard. He learned the rhythms of the diplomatic sessions, the long, careful mornings of position establishing, the afternoon working periods, the evenings that the Vorath used for what the translation rig called consolidation dialogue, and what Marcus came to understand as the long, unhurried synthesis of everything discussed, the 2 queens processing the day together in their identical and not identical way. He sat outside every session. He read the room through the door the way he'd learned to read every room he'd ever been outside of, through sound and movement and the register of change. He knew when the sessions were going well and when they were not. He knew when Tessavrath was choosing her words with particular care, and when Veth had reached a conclusion that the session had not yet caught up to. He told himself he was doing his job. He was also learning them. He had not in his career made a particular practice of learning his principles. You learned enough to do the job, habits, routines, threat patterns, how they moved under stress, what their tells were when something was wrong before they said something was wrong. That was the functional knowledge of protection. What he was doing now was different. What he was doing now was the thing that Ajani had named but not described, the whatever you did, which was looking at them as though they were worth looking at, which was another way of saying that he was interested. Not professionally. Actually. The queens noticed. Of course they noticed. They noticed everything. On the 12th day, during the evening that the rig called consolidation dialogue, Tessavrath knocked on the corridor wall, a low pressure pulse that Marcus felt in his palm through the wall. And when he opened the door, she asked him, through the portable rig she'd taken to carrying, if he would sit with them. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about protocols. He thought about the gap between expected and actual. He sat with them. He didn't understand most of what the consolidation dialogue was. The translation rig worked slowly on their unguarded speech, the speech they used when they weren't calibrating for interspecies communication. And what it produced was partial and fragmented and full of ellipses where it simply couldn't find the word. But he sat in the warm, atmospheric-amended air and listened to the sounds of them thinking together, the rhythm of two voices that had learned each other so completely that the learning had become the self. And he thought that you didn't need to understand a thing fully to know that it was real. The same way you didn't need to understand a language to know when people were being honest in it. He was being honest in it too. He just wasn't saying anything. On the 18th day, something happened that was not in any threat assessment. They asked him about his mother. Not directly. Veth asked through the rig in her particular way, precise and still and carrying everything she meant, what the song was, the one from the corridor, the 2 bars. He told them. He told them more than he'd intended to, which was a thing that happened sometimes with questions that came in that particular voice, that precise quality of wanting to actually know. He told them it was a lullaby, something old, something his mother had sung in the kitchen when he was very small and the world was the size of one apartment, and the sounds from outside were different from the sounds inside, and the sounds inside were safe. He told them she died when he was 11. He told them he hadn't thought about the song in years, consciously, that it had surfaced in the corridor without his permission. The rig translated his words slowly into Vorath. He watched both queens receive it. Tessavrath said after a long pause, "We have something like that, not a song, but the rig labored on the word a pattern that our mother made when we were very young. That still comes when we are not thinking." "Where is she now?" Marcus asked. "Gone," said Tessavrath, and Veth at the same moment in exactly the same tone through the rig said, "Gone." He thought about 2 voices saying the same word at the same moment, and meaning the same thing in the same way, and the word being gone. He said, "I'm sorry." They were both still for a moment. Then Veth said, "We know." He thought, "Yes, I imagine you do." On the 31st day, with 9 days left in the mission, Marcus Hale did something he had not done in his career. He told his principal that he was going to miss the assignment when it ended. He hadn't planned to say it. He'd been doing a post-session check of the room, moving through it in the automatic way of thorough training, opening closets and checking corners and verifying nothing had been left that shouldn't be left. Tessavrath was still in the room, doing the something that the rig had on different occasions called processing and synthesizing and being in the aftermath of thought. He'd been about to leave when he said it. "I'm going to miss this," he said, "when it's over." He didn't specify what this was. He thought she probably knew. The rig, the mission. "The work," he said, "these rooms, you." He thought about adding both of you and decided it was implied. "I don't usually feel that at the end of an assignment." A pause, then, "What do you usually feel?" He thought about it honestly. "Finished," he said, "ready for the next one." "And now?" He stood in the room that smelled of gardenia and Particle accelerator and thought about 9 more days and what came after 9 more days, which was a transit back to a conclave station, and a new briefing and new rooms to learn and different shapes of extraordinary. He thought about 30 hours in configuration and consolidation dialogue, and a woman saying "gone" in a voice that matched her sister's voice exactly, because they had the same loss in the same exact way. "Not finished," he said, "something else." Tessavrath was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought the conversation was over and began to move toward the door. Then the rig said, slowly, as though she was choosing each word with great care, "We are not finished either, we think." He stopped walking, he turned. She had her primary limbs in the configuration, the one that meant remaining. She wasn't going anywhere. "We think," she said through the rig, "that some things are not assignments that end. Some things are something that keeps." We do not have the word in your language. We don't always have it in ours either, he said. Another pause. But you know the thing, she said, without the word. He looked at her. She had no eyes, and he looked at her anyway, because the gesture still mattered, because it had always mattered, because looking at someone as though they were worth looking at was not about the mechanism. It was about the choice. Yes, he said, I know the thing. Veth appeared in the doorway. She had the quality she always had at the end of the working day, still and present and absolutely not empty. She looked at the room and at her sister and at Marcus, and Marcus thought, she already knows what we're talking about. She probably knew before Tessavrath said anything. She has the same breath in a different body, and she knows. Veth said through the portable rig, 9 days. Yes, Marcus said. Then we will need to decide, she said, what comes after 9 days. He said carefully, that's not typically my decision to make. It is, said Tessavrath, if we ask you to make it with us. He stood in the amber-adjacent warmth of the room, with the recyclers humming and 9 days left and both queens there, and thought about the thing that didn't have a word. He thought about all the things that lived in reports and all the things that didn't. He thought about 5 blades and the math of it and how simple the math had been, and he thought about what it meant to look at something as though it was worth looking at, and he thought about the particular truth that Veth had named on the first morning. We do not think it works only one direction. He said, then I'd like to talk about it. Both queens adjusted slightly, together in synchrony, the same breath. He recognized the adjustment, not the configuration that meant remaining, but something adjacent to it, something he hadn't seen before. He cataloged it, new, possibly significant. He thought about what category of significance it might fall into, and then he stopped thinking in categories, because categories were for the briefing, and this was the gap after the briefing, and he was learning to live in the gap. He pulled a chair from the table, he sat down, he looked at both of them. He said, tell me about the thing that doesn't have a word. And so, with 9 days left, and the recyclers humming and the Gardenian particle accelerator smell in the warm air, and a translation rig working overtime on the most difficult translation any rig had ever been asked to produce, they tried. They didn't get it perfectly. No language gets the important things perfectly. But they got close enough that the shape of it was there, a thing that keeps, a configuration that doesn't end, a responsibility that is not one direction. The same breath in 2 bodies, extended to include a third body that breathed differently and saw with actual eyes, and had hummed 2 bars of a lullaby in a corridor without choosing to. He took 5 blades for them. They sat in configuration for 30 hours. And then, carefully, imperfectly, without the word but with the thing itself, they tried to build something that would still be there in 10 days and in 10 months and in the years after that, when the reports had been filed and the mission had ended, and what was left was the thing that kept. It was very human in a way, and it was very Vorath in a way. And mostly it was the thing that happened in the gap between expected and actual, which was the most real place Marcus Hale had ever known. He counted 5 blades, he named them like always. Then he put them away and paid attention to what was in the room instead. There is a particular kind of knowledge that arrives in the body before the mind catches up to it. Marcus Hale had learned this over years of work in difficult places. The knowledge that a room had changed before you could say how. The knowledge that the person you were watching was about to move before they moved. The knowledge that something was wrong in the gap between one breath and the next. He trusted this knowledge more than he trusted almost anything else. It had never lied to him. In the final days of the mission, it told him something he did not entirely know how to process. He had done this work for 11 years. He had protected people whose lives were worth protecting, and he had done it well, and he had moved on, each time, with the clean readiness he described to Tessavrath, finished, and ready for the next one. He had not carried them with him. That was not a failure of feeling. It was the architecture of survival. You gave the job everything and then you gave it away cleanly, because the carrying was a weight that accumulated, and the weight would eventually slow you down in a moment when being slow was the last thing anyone needed. He was not going to be able to give this one away cleanly. He sat with that knowledge on the 38th day, with 2 days left, in the corridor outside the diplomatic session room, and let it be true without trying to solve it. He was not going to be able to give this one away cleanly, and he was not sure what that meant for the architecture of survival, and he was going to have to find out. That was all. That was the whole of it. On the 39th day, Queen Veth came to find him. Not during a session break, not through Commander Yes or the diplomatic officer. She simply came to where he was standing post in the afternoon corridor, and she stood near him, at the distance the rig had once called close but respectful, and she said, through the portable device, "You are deciding something." He said, "I'm standing post." "You are also deciding something," she said. He thought about denying it. He thought about how useful denial had ever been when someone was paying close attention. "Yes," he said. "What are you deciding?" He thought about the architecture of survival. He thought about the weight that accumulated. He thought about 9 days ago and what he had said to Tessavrath and what had come after, the conversation that the translation rig had labored over, the shape of the thing they had been building. He said, "Whether I am the kind of person who can hold onto something." A pause. Veth had a particular quality to her pauses. They weren't empty. They were a form of thought made visible or made present or made felt. He had learned to wait in them. "We held on to something," she said, "in the corridor when everything was wrong." He looked at her. "You didn't let go," he said. "No," she said, "we did not." He thought about the fourth blade and the movement he hadn't been able to track Tessavrath behind him, where she shouldn't have been, a position she had moved to deliberately, a test that was also a kind of trust. He thought about 5 blades as the answer to a question the situation had asked. He thought about 30 hours. He said, "I don't know how to do this differently than I've done everything else." "How have you done everything else?" "By being completely present and then moving on." "And now?" He looked at the corridor. He looked at the door to the session room. He thought about the amber room and the configuration and the queen sitting with him through 30 hours of sleep and repair, marking that they remained. He said, "I don't want to move on." Veth was still in her precise way. Then she said, "Then don't." He said, "It's not that simple." "No," she said, "it is not, but simple is not the same as impossible." And she paused, and he waited in the pause, and then she said, "We are also not moving on." If that is a relevant piece of information. He thought about the same breath in 2 bodies. He thought about what it meant that both of them had made the same decision, together, in the way they made everything, not by conferring but by already knowing. "It's relevant," he said. "We thought it might be," said Veth. He was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed. The recyclers ran their even breath. Somewhere inside the session room, Tessavrath was doing the work of diplomacy with the same precision she brought to everything, and she already knew this conversation was happening, and she was not surprised by any of it. He said, "After the mission ends, what does that look like?" Veth said, "We don't know yet. We have not done this before." "Neither have I." "Then," she said, with the quality of absolute still presence that was the opposite of absence, "we will have to find out together." He thought about the briefing that had said the Voreth didn't use blades. He thought about everything that happened in the gap between what a briefing said and what actually happened. He thought about the gap as a place, not a failure of intelligence, not an unknown to be resolved, but a place you could learn to live in if you were paying attention. He thought about what he'd found there. 2 queens, 5 blades, a song in a corridor, a configuration that meant remaining, the thing that doesn't have a word. He thought about his mother's lullaby and how it had surfaced without permission in a moment when everything was loud and wrong. Because the body knows things before the mind does, and what the body knew in that moment, what it had always known, was what mattered. He said, "Okay." Just that, just the word. Veth was quiet for a moment. Then she touched the pressure pulse on the portable rig, and something came through it that the device had no translation for, a sound or a vibration or something at the edge of both, and Marcus Hale put his hand flat on the wall beside him and felt it in his palm and understood it without the word. "We will remain." He kept his post. He watched the corridor. He did his job the way he had always done his job, completely and without reservation, because that was what it meant to look at something as though it was worth looking at. You gave it everything, not because you were required to, but because you believed in it. He believed in them. He had taken 5 blades and he would take 5 more, and he knew they knew it, and they had sat in configuration for 30 hours and they would sit again, and he knew that too. The mission ended on the 40th day. What came after it was not something any briefing could contain. It was the gap, extended. It was the place after the expected and before the actual, which turned out to be very large and very warm and lit from everywhere and nowhere in amber. He learned it the way he learned everything, as though it was worth learning. It was.